17 police visits in 6 months. That's not a typo, 17. I retired from the federal bench expecting peace, maybe some heirloom tomatoes and a quiet porch swing, and instead, I got a HOA president with a clipboard and a vendetta. The day I moved back to the Grayson Ranch, land my grandfather tamed with nothing but calloused hands and mule-stubborn faith, I was greeted not by neighbors but by a manila envelope thicker than my high school yearbook. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge Preserve," it said, in a font that screamed both wealth and pettiness. Inside, rules, pages of rules, regulations about curtain shades, mailbox fonts, and acceptable flower pot materials. Rule 17.3, for instance, insisted garbage cans be aligned precisely 90 degrees to the curb, not 89, not 91, 90. I laughed until I realized they weren't joking. They'd rather measure trash angles than introduce themselves. Leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. If you love wild, true-feeling stories packed with twists, justice, and just the right amount of HOA chaos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story is even more jaw-dropping, and trust me, the surprises coming next, you won't want to miss them. You'd think a 50-acre ranch that predates the neighborhood by 100 years would be immune to this madness. Think again. The HOA president, Deborah Langston, picture a cross between Martha Stewart and a prison warden, rolled up my driveway in a beige golf cart so pristine it probably had its own moisturizer. She greeted me with a rehearsed smile and that overly polite tone people use when they're about to tell you, "You're doing everything wrong." "Mr. Grayson," she chirped, "your fence seems non-compliant." Non-compliant? Lady, this fence has survived 4 generations, 3 blizzards, and 1 lightning strike. But apparently it was no match for Deborah's approved architectural palette. Then she said something that triggered every legal instinct I'd ever honed on the bench. "You know, this land has hidden potential many would love to unlock." That wasn't a suggestion, that was a warning disguised as a compliment. Now, I may be 72, but I didn't spend 4 decades interpreting law just to get pushed around by a suburban Napoleon with a bylaws binder. That night, I poured a whiskey, opened my laptop, and started digging. Property deeds, zoning maps, survey records. I went all the way back to 1921, the original homestead claim filed by my grandfather. And wouldn't you know it, every single record confirmed what I already knew in my bones. My land sits completely outside Cedar Ridge Preserve. Their jurisdiction ends exactly where the old oak boundary marker stands, a weathered tree with a carved triangle and circle symbol my grandfather once called the ranch's guardian. Deborah Langston had no legal authority over my land. None. Zip. Nada. So why was she acting like she did? The first violation arrived 2 days later. $50, 0 cents for trash can misalignment. According to the citation, mine was at 87 degrees instead of 90. They included a diagram, complete with arrows and trajectory lines like I was launching a rocket instead of taking out garbage. I tossed it straight into the same trash can, still crooked, and went about planting tomatoes. But the notices kept coming like clockwork. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black. My driveway gravel exceeded the authorized stone diameter. My 1971 Ford pickup truck, God bless it, was labeled an aesthetic disruption. I'd spent a career sentencing criminals for embezzlement, racketeering, and fraud. But none of them had the raw, relentless pettiness of this woman, with a laminated handbook and a God complex. At first I laughed it off, called it retirement theater. I even started a file labeled HOA Comedy Hour. But then came the surveillance cameras. First 1, then 3. All mounted just outside my fence line but aimed directly at my house, my driveway, and my barn. And then the neighbors stopped waving. Kids who used to wave at my horses were now steered away by cautious mothers. Deborah had emailed the entire community warning them about a non-compliant resident exhibiting antisocial behavior. She didn't name me, of course, but she didn't have to. I was the only house west of the oak marker. That's when the humor faded and something heavier settled in, because this wasn't about trash cans anymore. This was about pushing me off my land, and I had the sinking feeling that Deborah Langston wasn't working alone. I woke up one morning and found a camera staring at me, not a friendly doorbell kind or some half-dead security thing from Radio Shack. No, this was the kind of camera you'd use to monitor a cartel compound. High-def, night vision, motion tracking. It had been installed right outside the Cedar Ridge fence line, mounted high like a vulture that couldn't wait for me to slip up. And it wasn't alone. Within a week, there were 3 to 1 aimed at my front gate, 1 angled down my driveway, and the 3rd staring straight at my barn. That barn had seen more honest labor than any HOA boardroom, but now it was being filmed like I was running a black market livestock ring. And I couldn't help but wonder, who installs $50,000 0 cents worth of surveillance just to make sure a retired man isn't smuggling illegal chrysanthemums? This shift in the neighborhood was quiet but sharp, like someone flipping a switch from welcome to watch out. People who used to wave during their jogs now crossed to the other side of the road like I was contagious. A woman walking her golden retriever looked up, saw me adjusting my sprinkler, and practically sprinted the other way. It didn't take long to figure out why. Deborah had sent out one of her famous HOA blasts titled Community Safety Advisory. She didn't mention me by name, but it described a recently returned resident exhibiting aggressive disregard for community standards, exhibiting behavior inconsistent with neighborly norms. Subtle as a brick through a church window. The damage was done. I became the town's cautionary tale. Less neighbor, more neighborhood myth. And just like that, the isolation settled in like an old dog that wouldn't leave the porch. But I didn't sit back and sulk. If Deborah wanted a Cold War, fine. I'd bring the chill. First, I retrieved my extension ladder, climbed up real slow, and placed a single piece of black electrical tape right over the main camera's lens. Didn't touch the pole, didn't cross the property line, just gave her little surveillance monster a temporary cataract. The next morning, an HOA crew was out there, flailing around like their satellite had lost contact with Earth. That afternoon, I planted a row of fast-growing bamboo right along the sightline. Nothing says privacy like a green wall with an attitude. I wasn't breaking rules. I was landscaping with purpose. And that's when I started thinking. Maybe I wasn't the only one being watched, measured, and slowly pushed toward the cliff's edge. Turns out, I wasn't. One afternoon, while I was repairing a section of old fence, a young man approached, walking like he expected Deborah to jump out of the bushes. He introduced himself as Ben Ramirez, lived 3 houses into Cedar Ridge. Nervous guy, looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He said he admired how I was standing my ground, then admitted his own family had racked up nearly $3,000 0 cents in HOA fines in 6 months. Everything from improper toy store to the apparently heinous crime of letting his daughter's pink playhouse clash with the approved color scheme. His wife, he confessed, had begun having panic attacks every time she heard the golf cart, and he asked me a question that made the weight in my chest double. "Mr. Grayson, how do you fight something that's everywhere and invisible at the same time?" I didn't have an answer right then, but I knew I'd just found my first real ally. Ben and I talked for over an hour, comparing violation letters like old war wounds. And with every story he told, I saw it more clearly. This wasn't about enforcing neighborhood standards. This was a pressure campaign, quiet and methodical. One person gets fined over a mailbox, another for a tricycle on the porch, another for a wind chime that's too ethnically vibrant. The pattern wasn't coincidental, it was strategic. Deborah wasn't just enforcing rules, she was building something behind them. A system of silence, a hierarchy of fear. And the more I listened to Ben, the more I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't the end game. I was just the test run, which raised a terrifying question. If I wasn't the only target, what exactly was Deborah Langston building? I spent most of that weekend at my dining table, surrounded by old law books, HOA regulations, and enough printed violations to wallpaper a courthouse. If Deborah Langston wanted to turn neighborly disagreement into legal warfare, fine. but I had 4 decades of courtroom trench combat in my back pocket, so I wrote Ben Ramirez a rebuttal letter. Well, more like a guided missile in envelope form. It challenged every fine using the HOA's own bylaws: selective enforcement, failure to provide written notice, procedural gaps wide enough to drive my Ford pickup through. When I handed it to him, he looked at it like I'd passed him the nuclear codes. "Just read it word for word," I told him. "No improvising. Trust me." The look in his eyes said he hadn't trusted anyone in months, but he nodded. Sometimes all a man needs is a little borrowed courage. The HOA meeting that Tuesday felt like a courtroom dressed in beige. Folding chairs, passive-aggressive cookies, and a few dozen homeowners all pretending they weren't terrified of Deborah's clipboard. She opened the meeting like she always did, smiling like a crocodile before dinner. Then Ben stood up. His voice shook for the first few lines, but he found his footing about halfway through the second paragraph. By the third page, you could have heard a pin drop. He listed violations, questioned procedures, quoted HOA law back at her with the calm rhythm of someone who knew the rules better than she did. Deborah's face tightened like a jar lid someone else had already loosened. She fumbled through her notes, redirected questions, even attempted a recess. But the room had shifted, the murmurs started, heads turned, and for the first time people were looking at her like she was the problem, not the solution. It was a beautiful thing to watch. Like seeing a schoolyard bully realize the crowd had stopped laughing. After the meeting, Ben texted me one line. She tabled the fines, said she needed legal review. That's HOA speak for panic. I sat on my porch that night, boots up, sipping whiskey that tasted like minor victory and old leather. For a moment I allowed myself a smile, the kind that comes when the tables start to turn, and you remember you're not too old to push them yourself. But just as the evening settled in and I began dreaming about planting another row of tomatoes, the mail carrier dropped off a certified letter that felt heavier than it should have. The return address wasn't Cedar Ridge. It was Granite Ridge Holdings, Denver office. That smile didn't just fade. It evaporated. The letter was wrapped in that slick legal language corporations use when they want to sound polite while threatening to bulldoze your life. Granite Ridge claimed the right to conduct geological surveys on my land. Mineral exploration, they called it. They cited a lease agreement from the Langston Family Trust, granting them access, said there were potential copper deposits beneath my property. Beneath me, and they offered to buy my land at market rate, which is like offering a man a glass of water after lighting his house on fire. I read the letter twice. Then a third time. Same message, no matter how I sliced it. This wasn't about trash cans or gravel. It never had been. The HOA wasn't just drunk on power. It was hiding a corporate land grab in a Sunday dress. I sat in my study long past midnight, the letter spread out on the desk, my grandfather's dusty ranch map beside it. Something shifted in me. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a hostile extraction, dressed up in bylaws and fine print. I felt it in my chest. That courtroom fire I hadn't needed in years. Deborah Langston wasn't running a neighborhood. She was laying the groundwork for a corporate invasion. And if they thought an old man in boots would just roll over and sell, they hadn't read my resume. That night, for the first time since moving back, I didn't feel retired. I felt recruited. Because what was buried under my land might have had value, but what was buried behind their scheme was starting to look even richer. I sent the Granite Ridge letter to the only person I trusted to read between the corporate lines, Marcus Liu, my friend of 30 years and one of the sharpest property attorneys I'd ever seen work a courtroom. He called back an hour later, no pleasantries, just his voice low and deliberate. "Walter, you're sitting on a copper deposit they estimate north of $50 million, and if this lease is legit, you're not just in their way. You're the last obstacle standing between them and a gold rush." I stared at the phone like it had just grown fangs. Marcus wasn't prone to exaggeration. If he sounded worried, I needed to be terrified, and suddenly every fine, every camera, every sideways glance made cruel, perfect sense. Deborah hadn't been enforcing rules, she'd been running interference. I leaned back in my chair, staring at my grandfather's old ledger on the shelf like it might whisper the answer. My mind flooded with questions I never thought I'd have to ask. Did someone in my family sign away the mineral rights decades ago? Was it buried in some ancient document under 3 generations of dust? The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd presided over land cases where families didn't know they'd sold the dirt under their feet until the bulldozers showed up. Back then, I pitied those poor souls for not reading the fine print. Now I was one of them, only the fine print had my name on it and a Denver lawyer licking his chops, and all I had to defend myself was a ranch, a memory, and a pile of tomato steaks. That night, I walked the property in silence. The wind moved through the cottonwoods like an old hymn. I stopped at every fence post my grandfather had driven into the ground, touched every board I'd helped him replace as a boy. My boots traced the path we'd taken to the creek every summer, where he taught me to fish with a pocket knife and patience. This land wasn't just acreage. It was blood memory, stitched together by sweat, weather, and family. And yet now it was reduced to an asterisk in someone else's lease agreement. They didn't see a legacy. They saw a number. They weren't after my land. They were after its bones. For a moment, just one honest moment, I considered selling, taking the buyout, buying a nice place in the city, and calling it a win for an old man with tired knees. I even pulled up some listings. But every time I clicked through photos of modern condos and artificial lawns, I saw my grandfather's hands, scarred, calloused, firm on my shoulder, reminding me what this place had cost him and what it might cost me if I let it go. This land was supposed to outlive all of us. That was the deal. That was the covenant. But now it felt like I was the last witness to something sacred about to be swallowed by people who never smelled Wyoming dirt in spring or watched calves stumble through their first snow. I poured another whiskey and sat with the letter one more time. The Granite Ridge seal glared back at me like a smug signature from the devil. And then I remembered something. A strange carving on the old oak boundary marker, triangle in a circle, crossed wheat stalks underneath. It had always been there, just part of the ranch to me, like a weathered tattoo, but now it gnawed at me. That symbol had meant something. My grandfather hadn't been sentimental. If he carved something into oak, it wasn't for decoration, it was a message, a warning, a key. I suddenly felt that same courtroom instinct spark to life, the feeling that I'd missed a clue hiding in plain sight. And if my grandfather foresaw this, if he really built something to outlast schemes like Deborah's, then the answer wasn't in the letter. It was buried somewhere on this land, waiting for me to remember how to read it. If you found this story or lesson helpful, send it to a friend who's been battling their own version of a neighborhood nightmare. Sometimes all it takes is one shared story to remind someone they're not crazy. They're just being railroaded. Leave a comment and let me know what you think of this story, or if you've ever had to outsmart an HOA with a clipboard and a God complex. I found it buried in the back of the barn, behind a stack of old irrigation crates and a trunk full of rusted branding irons. A small leather-bound box tucked inside a crate that hadn't been opened since gas was 30 cents a gallon. Inside it, wrapped in oilcloth and the unmistakable smell of generations, was a faded photograph. 4 men standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the oak boundary marker. One of them was my grandfather, staring down the camera with that same no-nonsense face he used whenever he caught me skipping fence duty. Scrawled on the back in careful script were the words, "The Covenant Makers, July 1948. Let this stand as proof against all claims. If the letter from Granite Ridge had dropped the floor out from under me, this photo felt like a hand pulling me back up. There was something here. Something older, deeper, and maybe, just maybe, stronger than any lease Deborah Langston could fabricate. That symbol on the marker, the triangle, circle, and the crossed wheat stalks, wasn't decorative after all. It was a seal, a stamp of intent. The triangle was the mountain, The circle for unity and the wheat, that was heritage. Not just land, agricultural preservation. My grandfather didn't just own land, he protected a way of life. The next morning, I was waiting outside the county records building before sunrise, armed with black coffee, a legal pad, and the kind of determination that turns old judges into courtroom legends. When the doors opened, the clerk took one look at me and waved me toward the archives, like she already knew I was going to be there a while. And she was right. 30 days. That's how long I dug through every file cabinet, ledger, and dusty survey record they had. I followed trails of easements, water rights, and land transfer contracts until my eyes blurred. But on the third day, shoved in the wrong drawer, misfiled under agricultural agreements, I found it. Covenant for the Preservation of Agricultural Integrity, recorded July 30th, 1948, signed by 4 men, my grandfather among them, each representing an adjacent property. The language was elegant, firm, and absolutely unambiguous. No parcel of this land shall be used, leased, or accessed for industrial or extractive purposes in perpetuity. The kicker? It included a clause stating that any violation would trigger a full reversion of all claims, mineral, surface, or otherwise, back to the original property owner or their heir. In other words, even if someone tried to lease it, the agreement would make that lease legally worthless. I could have stopped there, but something told me this wasn't just county business. These men were ranchers, sure, but they'd been smart, strategic. I drove straight to the state registry office 2 counties over and requested archival documents on agricultural land covenants. And there it was, state-sealed, notarized, and fully enforceable. Not just a handshake between neighbors, but a legally binding multi-party covenant filed at both county and state level. Most people don't realize how rare that is, especially in the 1940s. These men didn't just see trouble coming, they designed legal armor to stop it. I stood there in that fluorescent-lit room, holding what might as well have been Excalibur in paper form. Granite Ridge hadn't just miscalculated. They'd walked straight into a generational booby trap. Driving home that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Certainty. Not just about the law, but about the people who'd come before me. My grandfather hadn't needed a courtroom to make his case. He'd made it with foresight, neighbors, and a pen. The covenant wasn't just a document. It was a promise made by people who understood the cost of compromise. People who believed that just because you're born on a piece of land doesn't mean you get to treat it like a bank account. And now, all these years later, it was still speaking. Quietly, powerfully, through the pages of a forgotten file. And if I could prove it in court, then Granite Ridge wasn't a developer, they were trespassers. Which meant Deborah Langston wasn't just wrong, she was illegal. And I was about to make that very clear. Some people fight with fists. Others use lawyers. Me, I prefer timing, precision, the kind that makes a courtroom feel like a chessboard and the truth a checkmate waiting in silence. I spent the next few days refining my legal ambush. Every citation, every clause from that 1948 covenant laid out like dominoes ready to fall. But before I filed a single document, I wanted to see Deborah's face crack in real time. So I called Ben Ramirez. At the next HOA meeting, I said ask her one question and watch the room shift. He didn't even need a script, just 10 words. Is Cedar Ridge Preserve aware of the covenant of 1948? And when he said it loud, clear, and calmly in front of 30 residents and one increasingly pale HOA president, Deborah blinked like she'd been slapped by a ghost. She tried to recover, of course. Flipped through her binder, rearranged papers that didn't need rearranging, gave a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I am not familiar with any such document," she said, voice brittle as old parchment. But the damage was done. People in that room weren't looking at her like a leader anymore. They were looking at her like someone who had just been caught walking out of a locked room with a broken vase. Whispers started. The illusion cracked. And once an HOA queen loses the fear of her followers, she doesn't rule, she rots. I filed the lawsuit the next morning. Fraud, harassment and trespass, with a copy of the covenant attached like a nail in a coffin. Now, serving legal papers can be quiet, mailed, dropped off, whispered over coffee, but not this time. I'd specifically instructed the process server to deliver them at the Cedar Ridge annual summer gala, complete with white tents, a string quartet, and Deborah's favorite audience, herself. As the violinists played something elegant and meaningless, the server stepped onto the lawn like he was announcing a royal decree. "Deborah Langston, you are being sued for conspiracy to defraud, trespass under false claim, and violation of a recorded agricultural covenant. You could have bottled the silence that followed and sold it as revenge perfume." She stood frozen, surrounded by cucumber sandwiches and neighbors pretending not to stare. A queen with no kingdom, no escape, and a court full of witnesses. The courtroom filled faster than a Sunday potluck. Reporters, neighbors, even a few retired judges I hadn't seen in years showed up to watch the fireworks. I represented myself. Deborah brought 3 attorneys and enough paperwork to block a small dam, but paper doesn't win cases. Truth does. And when I entered the covenant into evidence, complete with historical filing, notarized signatures, and state-level enforcements, her defense team shifted in their seats like boys caught cheating on a math test. Then came my witness, Deputy Nick Russo, tall, steady, and unimpressed with theatrics. Under oath, he confirmed he'd been called to my property 17 times in 6 months. "And how many crimes did you find?" I asked. "None," he said plainly. "Not even a noise complaint that held up." Then I asked the question that sealed the deal. "Deputy Russo, is it true that your grandfather's name was Antonio Russo?" He nodded. "One of the original covenant signers," I added, handing him the photo I'd found in the barn. He smiled faintly. "He always told us this paper would matter someday." Deborah's attorneys objected, of course, but the judge allowed it. The truth had teeth, and it was biting. As I sat back, watching her try to hold herself together under the weight of history, I realized something satisfying. Deborah thought she was queen. But my grandfather set the board, and I'd just moved the final piece. The game wasn't just over, it was exposed. But one question still loomed over the whole room like thunder waiting to crack. Would justice hold? Or would power win again? Courtrooms have a rhythm, and this one was building like a gospel choir mid-revival. I started slow, methodical. Every violation notice, every photo of the cameras pointed like sniper scopes at my gate, emails from the HOA, the timeline, the lease agreement from the Langston Family Trust, a tidy package of intent dressed up as enforcement. I laid it out for the court like I was slicing vegetables, precise, unhurried, inevitable, and with each document, each citation, I peeled another layer off Deborah's mask. Her attorneys objected here and there, but mostly they sat frozen, realizing the train they were on had no brakes. You could feel it in the air. Everyone in the room knew where this was going. They just didn't know how loud the ending would be. When Deborah finally took the stand, she tried to maintain her composure, sat straight, clasped her hands like she was at a country club brunch instead of a fraud trial. But the cracks were already there. I asked simple questions, each one tighter than the last. Did you sign this trust agreement? Did you know about the covenant? Did you instruct the HOA to pursue fines against me, despite knowing I wasn't under HOA jurisdiction? Her answers got shorter. Her tone got sharper, and when I projected a copy of the HOA's founding paperwork on the screen, highlighting the line where she signed off acknowledging all existing covenants affecting adjacent properties, the dam broke. "That land is wasted on him," she shouted, all courtroom decorum evaporating. "My husband found the copper. We spent years planning this. I followed every rule, every procedure, and he still wouldn't move. I earned it." The room went dead silent. She kept going, unraveling right there on the witness stand, ranting about geological surveys, surveyor bribes, late-night meetings with lawyers, even HOA funds spent on strategic surveillance. Her attorneys tried to stop her, but they couldn't plug the leak fast enough. She admitted everything, openly, passionately, and without a shred of remorse. It wasn't just a confession, it was a meltdown in front of a full house. You could hear the collective gasp as the truth landed like a hammer in that courtroom. Residents looked at each other with the kind of realization that only comes after denial's been ripped clean away. One woman sobbed quietly, another man cursed under his breath. The judge, a stoic fellow who'd once been a student of mine, sat motionless for a long moment, then finally leaned forward with the weight of the law behind every syllable. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff on all counts," he said. "The Cedar Ridge Preserve HOA is hereby dissolved. All fines are vacated. A permanent injunction is issued against any mineral extraction activity, and Mrs. Langston," he added, "you are personally liable for punitive damages in the amount of $200,000, 0 cents. That last sentence hit harder than the gavel. Deborah didn't cry. She didn't plead. She just sat there, staring ahead like a queen who'd just learned the throne was rented and the castle belonged to someone else. Her lawyers packed up without making eye contact. People in the gallery started clapping before they remembered where they were. I stayed seated, not out of pride, but out of reflection. It wasn't victory I felt. It was justice. After months of being surveilled, slandered, and fined for sins as grave as crooked garbage cans, I'd finally cleared the smoke. But as I stood up and looked at the shaken faces of my neighbors, I realized this courtroom wasn't just about me. It was about a neighborhood too scared to breathe freely. And now that the tyrant had fallen, could the neighborhood rebuild without fear? The check arrived by courier, folded into a stiff legal envelope like it still wanted to argue. $200,000 in punitive damages, stamped and final. I stared at it for a long time, not because I needed it, but because I knew what it represented. It wasn't hush money, it was a refund for every ounce of peace Deborah Langston had tried to rob. But I didn't keep a dime. Instead, I called an impromptu meeting of the newly liberated Cedar Ridge residents. No clipboard, no quorum. Just a thermos of coffee, folding chairs, and a whiteboard that still smelled faintly of HOA threats. "I'm donating every penny of this settlement to launch the Cedar Ridge Community Fund," I told them. "Let's plant a garden, fix some fences, and help folks breathe a little easier." The applause was quiet at first, then full and honest. For once, the clapping didn't need permission from a board. By the end of that month, the transformation was visible. The no unauthorized gathering signs got yanked off the fences and repurposed as garden markers, painted over by the neighborhood kids, and relabeled things like carrots, zucchini, and goodbye, Karen. The surveillance poles came down with a community-wide bonfire that turned petty paranoia into ashes. Even the gravel rule was ceremonially buried beneath a new play area where kids ran barefoot. And funny thing about fear, once it lifts, people don't just relax, they bloom. Lawn chairs came out, neighbors brought food to share, and folks started waving again, not out of obligation, but out of joy. One afternoon, as I was tending to my tomatoes, now taller and more rebellious than ever, a young couple I hadn't met before approached the gate. The Johnsons, new to the area, drawn by stories of a neighborhood that fought back. The husband tipped his hat and the wife asked shyly if I might have any advice on starting a garden. "Advice?" I said, grinning. "You bet! But I'm not responsible if you get addicted to home-grown tomatoes. Happens to the best of us." I gave them a tour, clipped some starter seedlings, and sent them home with enough knowledge and compost jokes to last the season. It wasn't mentorship. It was inheritance. One passed without wills or titles, just seeds, soil, and stubborn hope. Difference between then and now? Deborah brought rules in a golf cart. The Johnsons brought hope on foot. That's how you know something real is happening. It's not loud. It's not in all caps. It doesn't come with bylaws or citations. It walks quietly, knocks politely, and asks to borrow a shovel. Cedar Ridge had once been a kingdom of fear, and now it felt like a neighborhood again. No mandatory meetings, no threats about mailbox fonts, just folks with dirt under their nails and smiles that didn't need translation. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sun tuck itself behind the hills, I realized the truth. My grandfather didn't leave me land. He left me something more dangerous. He left me a covenant. Not just on paper, but in the way he built fences, the way he greeted neighbors, the way he carved that symbol into the oak like a promise. And all I'd done was make sure it still spoke when it was needed most. Deborah wanted silence and compliance. In the end, she got it. She just wasn't here to enjoy it.